What's up, folks? I'm Dan, and welcome to I've Been Meaning to Read That, the show where I read books out loud that I've been meaning to read. Let's go. Happy tax season, people. And by happy tax season, I mean, if you are suffering like the rest of us, God bless you, and I'm right in the garbage with you, folks. See, the reason, if you're not aware, that people hate tax season is because it is never as smooth a process as it should be, right? You're just filing some government documents. It should be simple. You should get all your income paperwork from your job and then go see a person, and they enter all that data into a form, and then you should be done. It should take an hour. Really, not any time at all. Unfortunately, sometimes you lose important documents that you need, and the only way to get that is to call former employers, and then they may or may not send it to the right address, and so you have to call back, and then you have to either try to save money by using some online service where they upsell the crap out of you, or you have to go into an office to see a person who is probably not a super pleasant person, and they'll do the work for you, and then you have to pay a lot of money, which is very annoying. And the worst part is that you know deep in the back of your mind that the only reason tax season is like this is because the companies that file your taxes for you are greedy as heck and lobby the government to keep the tax code complicated. You know, in other countries, they don't do this. The government just keeps track of how much you make from your job, and then they say, oh, you paid too much or you didn't pay enough, and they send you a check or a bill, and that's it. You don't have to do any of this nonsense. And yet, every spring, here I am, wasting my weekend trying to figure out what's going on with my taxes. All right. You know who had it worse than me, though? Is Jean Valjean. So let's take a look and see what's going on with prisoner 24601 himself in Les Miserables. Book 4. To trust is sometimes to surrender. Chapter 1. A meeting between mothers. During the first quarter of this century, in the village of Montfermeil, not far from Paris, there existed a small tavern which has since disappeared. It was kept by a couple called Thénardier and was situated in the Ruelle de Bourgogne. Nailed to the wall over the door was a board with a painted design depicting a soldier carrying another on his back, the latter clad in the starred and braided uniform of a general. Splashes of red paint represented blood, and the rest of the picture was filled with what was presumably the smoke of battle. Across the bottom ran the inscription, "The Sergeant of Waterloo." Nothing is more commonplace than a cart or wagon outside a tavern, but the vehicle, or remains of a vehicle, which was to be seen outside the Sergeant of Waterloo on a certain spring evening in 1818, must surely have attracted the notice of a passing painter by its massive proportions. It was the forepart of one of those drags used by foresters for carrying sawn timbers and tree trunks, consisting of a massive iron pivot with an axle shaft and two very large wheels. The general effect, resembling the gun carriage of an enormous cannon, was lumbering and shapeless. Wheels, hubs, and shaft were smothered in a thick coating of yellow mud, not unlike the plaster sometimes daubed on cathedrals. The woodwork was hidden under mud and the metalwork under rust, and from the axle there hung in loops a great chain that could have served to secure a criminal Goliath. It might have been designed for the harnessing of mastodons rather than the transport of timber, and it had a look of prison about it, superhuman fetters that could have been struck off the limbs of some monster. Homer might have associated it with Polyphemus, Shakespeare with Caliban. What was it doing there? It served no purpose except to block the street until it moldered into dust. Our ancient social order is filled with similar encumbrances, surviving for no other reason. The lower part of the looped chain hung close to the ground, and seated on it, as though it were a swing, forming a pretty group, were two little girls, the elder, aged about 2.5, holding the younger, aged 18 months, in her arms. A shawl had been carefully tied to prevent them falling. Some mother, seeing that unsightly chain, had thought, "What a nice toy for the children." The two children, who looked well cared for, were clearly delighted with it. They were like roses on a scrap heap, their eyes bright, their pink cheeks round with laughter. One was russet-haired, the other dark. The innocent faces shone with excitement, and the smaller of the two, with the chaste indecency of childhood, displayed a stretch of bare stomach. Above and around this picture of a happiness loomed the piece of monstrous, mud-coated wreckage, its uncouth, twisted shape causing it to resemble the mouth of a cavern. The mother, a woman of no very attractive appearance, but likable at that moment, was seated a few yards away in the doorway of the tavern, swinging the children by pulling on a length of string, while at the same time she kept an eye on them with that protective watchfulness, half animal, half angelic, which is the quality of motherhood. With every movement the rusty lynx emitted a screech like a cry of protest. The children squealed with delight, the glow of sunset shone upon their rapture, and nothing could have been more charming than this freak of chance that had turned an ugly monstrosity into a swing for cherubs. While she swung the children, the mother was tunelessly singing a popular sentimental ditty of the moment. Her preoccupation with this, and with them, caused her to ignore what was going on in the street. But suddenly a voice spoke from close beside her. "You have two very pretty children, madame." The woman broke off her song and looked round. A young woman was standing near her. She, too, had a child which she held in her arms. She also had with her a large traveling bag which looked very heavy. The child was the most enchanting creature imaginable, a little girl of between 2 and 3, the prettiness of whose attire matched that of the innkeeper's children. She wore a linen bonnet trimmed with Valenciennes lace, and a ribboned frock whose rumpled skirt disclosed a firm, white, dimpled thigh. She was apple-cheeked, pink, and healthy. Nothing could be seen of her closed eyes except that they were large with very long lashes. She was sleeping in her mother's arms with the perfect confidence of her age. The mother, who seemed poor and unhappy, had the look of a town worker reverting to her peasant state. She was young and perhaps pretty, but the clothes she was wearing did not allow this to appear. A single lock of her seemingly abundant fair hair had escaped from beneath the tight, plain cap that she wore tied under her chin. A smile might have shown that she had fine teeth, but she did not smile. She looked indeed as though it were a long time since she had been dry-eyed. She was pale and evidently tired, and her gaze, as she glanced at her sleeping child, was one of intense solicitude. A large blue kerchief, like an invalid's shawl, draped the upper part of her body, with beneath it a calico dress and thick shoes, and over all a cloak of coarse wool. Her hands were rough and freckled, one forefinger pricked and calloused. It was Fantine. It was Fantine, but scarcely to be recognized, although a closer examination would have shown that she still retained her beauty. But now a line of sadness, like the beginning of cynicism, ran down her right cheek. The airy garments, the gauzes and muslins, the gaiety and music, all this had vanished like the sparkle of hoarfrost from a tree, leaving only the blackened branches behind. 10 months had elapsed since the merry prank, and it is not hard to imagine what had happened in that time. After heedlessness had come the reckoning. Fantine had at once lost touch with Favourite, Zéphine, and Dahlia. The bond broken by the men had been cast aside by the women, and they would have been surprised a fortnight later if anyone had reminded them that they had once been friends, since now their friendship served no purpose. Fantine was left in solitude. Being abandoned by the father of her child, and such partings, alas, are irrevocable, she was thrown entirely on her own resources, having lost the habit of work and gained an aptitude for pleasure. The liaison with Ptolemies had caused her to despise her former calling. She had neglected the employments that had once been open to her, and now had lost them. Nothing else was offered. She could scarcely read, and could not write, having been taught as a child only to sign her name. She paid a letter-writer to write to Ptolemies, 3 letters in all, but he did not answer. She heard the street gossips murmur as they looked at her child. "Does any man worry about these byblows? They simply shrug their shoulders." And her heart was hardened towards Ptolemies. What was she to do now? Where was she to turn? She had done wrong, but she was essentially modest and virtuous. Perceiving the depth of degradation that threatened her, she had the fortitude to resist it. She resolved to return to her native town, Montreuil-sur-Mer, where someone who knew her might give her work. It meant that she would have to conceal the evidence of her wrongdoing, and confusedly she foresaw another separation, even more heartrending than the first. But she held to her resolution. Fantine, as we shall see, possessed great courage in the face of life. She had already renounced all personal adornment, wearing the plainest clothes and reserving her silks and laces for her daughter, her one remaining vanity and one which she held sacred. She sold all her possessions, which produced 200 francs, but only 80 remained after her debts were paid. And on a fine spring morning she left Paris, a girl of 22 with her baby on her back. Those who saw them pass may well have pitied them. The girl had nothing in the world except her child, the child nothing except her mother. Fantine had breastfed her, and this had weakened her chest, causing her to cough a little. We shall have no further occasion to mention Monsieur Felix Tholomyès. It is enough to say that 20 years later, under King Louis Philippe, he had become an influential, rich, and portly provincial attorney, a prudent voter, and stern magistrate, but always a man of pleasure. In the early afternoon, having traveled a part of the way at the cost of a few sous in one of the small public conveyances which then operated on the outskirts of Paris, Fantine reached Montfermeil and presently found herself in the Ruelle du Boulanger. Passing the Thénardiers' tavern, she had seen the two children on their improvised swing. There are sights which cast a spell, and for the young mother, this was one of them. She stood gazing in enchantment, seeming to see in them the pointing finger of Providence itself. They were so evidently happy. Such was her delight that when the mother paused for breath between two lines of her song, she could not refrain from murmuring, "You have two very pretty children." The fiercest animals are disarmed by a tribute to their young. The mother thanked her and invited her to step on the bench by the door, while she herself remained seated on the step. "My name is Thénardier," she said. "My husband and I keep this inn." This Madame Thénardier was robust, big-boned, and red-headed, a typical soldier's woman with the roughness characteristic of her kind, yet, oddly, with a hint of sentiment, a kind of mannish simper which she owed to her fondness for popular fiction, those Faustian romances which cater for the fantasy of shop-girls and tavern wenches. She was still young, not more than 30. Had she been standing upright, instead of sitting crouched in the doorway, her height and general look of a fair-ground wrestler might have alarmed the stranger, and so shaken her confidence as to prevent the events to be related from taking place. Destinies may be decided by the fact that a person is seated and not standing. Fantine told her story, altering it slightly. She was a working woman whose husband had died, and since she could not find work in Paris, she was on her way to look for it in her own part of the country. She had left Paris on foot that morning, had traveled part of the way in a country omnibus, and had walked from Villemomble to Montfermeil. Her little girl had walked a part of the way, but was still very small. In the end, she had had to pick her up, and the poor love had fallen asleep. "You shall have them," said Cosette's mother. "I've got 80 francs. I shall still have enough to get me to my own country if I go on foot, and I'll find work, and when I've saved a little money, I'll come for her." The man's voice asked, "Has she enough clothes?" "That's my husband," said Madame Thénardier. "I guessed as much. Certainly she has enough clothes. She has a beautiful wardrobe, plenty of everything, and silk dresses like a lady. They're all in my bag." "You'll have to let us have them," said the man's voice. "Well, naturally. Did you think I'd leave my daughter to go naked?" The man's face appeared in the doorway. "All right," he said. And so the bargain was concluded. Fantine stayed the night at the tavern, paid the money, left her daughter and the clothes, and set off next morning with a greatly lightened bag, expecting soon to return. It had happened quietly enough, but such partings are loaded with despair. A neighbor who saw her leave the town said later to Madame Thénardier, "I've just seen a girl in the street sobbing as though her heart would break." Monsieur Thénardier said to his wife, "Well, that takes care of the bill that falls due tomorrow. I was 50 short. Do you realize I might have been summoned? That was a neat trap you set, you and the kids between you." "And not even meaning to," said the lady. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. First sketch of two mean figures. A modest bag, but to the cat even the smallest mouse is better than none. Who were these Thénardiers? We may deal with them briefly for the present. The picture will be filled in later. They belonged to that indeterminate layer of society, sandwiched between the middle and the lower classes, which consists of riffraff who have risen in the world and more cultivated persons who have sunk, and which combines the worst qualities of both, having neither the generosity of the worker nor the respectable honesty of the bourgeoisie. They were dwarfish natures, capable of growing into monsters if ill chance fostered the process. There was a seed of cruelty in the woman and of blackguardism in the man, and both were highly susceptible to the encroachments of evil. There are human creatures which, like crayfish, always retreat into shadow, going backwards rather than forwards through life, gaining in deformity with experience, going from bad to worse, and sinking into even deeper darkness. The Thénardiers were of this kind. The man especially was a problem for the physiognomist. There are men whom we instantly mistrust, sensing the void that encloses them. They are uneasy at their back and threatening in front. They contain an unknown element, so that one cannot answer for what they have done or will do. The shiftiness of their eyes betrays them. To hear them speak or see them move is to catch a glimpse of dingy secrets in the past and dark mystery in the future. Thénardier, so he said, had been a soldier, a sergeant who, by his own account, had fought bravely in the 1815 campaign. We shall learn in due course what this amounted to. His tavern sign bore witness to his feats of arms. He had painted it himself, being a jack-of-all-trades who did everything badly. It was the period when historical novels with classical settings, ranging from the works of Mademoiselle de Scudéry to those of Madame Barthélemy Hadot, high-minded in tone but increasingly vulgar in content, were indulging the romantic tastes of Paris concierges and penetrating further afield. Madame Thénardier had just sufficient intelligence to read books of this kind, and she devoured them, soaking in them what little mind she possessed. Because of this, she adopted an attitude of romantic subservience toward her husband, who was a ruffian with a gloss of education, at once crude and plausible, but an admirer of the sentimentalities of Pigault Lebrun, and rigidly conventional in matters of the fair sex, to use his own words. She was some 15 years younger than her husband. When later the tearful novelette began to lose its vogue, and Richardson's Pamela was replaced by Harridan's, she became nothing but a spiteful woman who had reveled in silly fiction. But one cannot be unaffected by that sort of thing. One of its results was that her elder daughter was named Éponine. The younger, having narrowly escaped being called Gulnare, was christened Azelma. It may be remarked in passing that this particular aspect of the strange period with which we are concerned, what may be termed the anarchy of baptismal names, was not wholly absurd or trivial. It was a social symptom as well as an offshoot of romantic fiction. Farm lads in the present day quite commonly bear such names as Arthur, Alfred, Alphonse, whereas the Vicomte, if Vicomtes still exist, is named Thomas, Pierre, or Jacques. This reversal, whereby the elegant name is bestowed on the rustic and the rustic name on the aristocrat, is a manifestation of the spread of equality. The blowing of a new wind is to be felt, here as elsewhere, and behind the paradox we may discern an event of great and profound significance, the French Revolution. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Lark. Mere lack of scruple does not ensure prosperity. The tavern was doing badly. Thanks to their visitors' 57 francs, Thénardier was able to honor his signature and escape a summons, but a month later they were again short of money. Madame Thénardier took Cosette's wardrobe to Paris and pawned it for 60 francs. When this was spent, the couple came to regard her as a charity child and to treat her accordingly. Since she no longer had any clothes of her own, she was dressed in the Thénardier children's discarded garments, that is to say, in rags. She was fed on the family leavings, a little better than the dog, and rather worse than the cat. Indeed, the cat and dog were her companions, for she ate with them under the table from a wooden bowl like their own. Fantine, as we shall see in due course, found employment in Montreuil-sur-Mer and wrote a monthly letter, or, to be exact, had one written for her. She asked for news of her daughter. The Thénardiers invariably replied that Cosette was in splendid health. When the first 6 months expired, Fantine sent them the agreed monthly sum of 7 francs, and she continued to do so each month. But by the end of the year, Thénardier was saying, "Handsome, isn't it? What's the good of 7 francs?" He wrote demanding 12, and Fantine, being persuaded that her child was happy and doing fine, meekly paid up. There are natures which must compensate for love with hate. Because she doted on her own children, Madame Thénardier came to detest the outsider. It is sad to reflect that mother love can have its ugly side. Small though the demands were which Cosette made upon her, she felt that they were at the expense of her own children, as though they were being robbed of part of the very air they breathed. Like many women of her kind, she had only a limited store of kindness and malice to bestow. Had it not been for Cosette, her daughters, adored though they were, would have come in for the lot. Thanks to the newcomer, they were spared the blows and only received the caresses. Cosette could scarcely move without bringing on herself a storm of violent and undeserved chastisement. This was the atmosphere she lived in, a gentle, defenseless little creature, knowing nothing of the world or of God, constantly nagged at, slapped, and punished, and seeing in contrast 2 children like herself who were showered with affection. Since Madame Thénardier ill-treated Cosette, Éponine and Azelma did the same, imitating their mother as children of that age commonly do. Thus 2 years passed. The village gossips said, "Those Thénardiers are good people. They're not rich, but they're bringing up a pauper child who is planted on them." It was believed that Cosette had been abandoned by her mother. Meanwhile, Thénardier, having by some devious means discovered that the child was probably illegitimate, had raised the price to 15 francs. The creature, as he called her, was growing and never stopped eating, and he threatened to return her to her mother. "She'd better not argue," he said to his wife, "or I'll dump the brat on her and give the show away. I've got to have more." Fantine paid the 15 francs. The years went by, the child grew, and so did her state of wretchedness. While she was still very small, she had served as a scapegoat for the other 2, but as she grew older, that is to say, by the time she was 5, she became the household drudge. At the age of 5, this may seem inconceivable, but alas, it is true. Social oppression may begin at any age. Have we not recently witnessed the trial of a youth named Dumoulin, an orphan turned thief who, according to the official report, being left destitute at the age of 5, worked for his living and stole? Cosette was made to run errands, scrub floors, sweep the yard and the pavement, wash the dishes, and even carry large burdens, and the Thénardiers felt this treatment to be the more justified since her mother, who was still in Montreuil, was no longer paying regularly. She was some months in arrears. If Fantine had returned to Montfermeil at the end of 3 years, she would not have known her daughter. The bright, pretty child she had left at the inn was now thin and pale-faced. She had a furtive air, sly, the Thénardiers said. Ill treatment had made her sullen, and misery had made her ugly. Only the beauty of her eyes remained, and this was the more distressing because, being large, they mirrored a greater measure of unhappiness. It was heartrending to see her, a child not yet 6, shivering in scanty, tattered garments, busy before daybreak on a winter's morning, sweeping the pavement outside the house with a broom far too big for her small, chapped hands. She was known locally as La Alouette, the lark. The village people, with instinctive symbolism, had thought it a suitable name for the apprehensive, trembling little creature, scarcely more than a bird, who was always first up in that house and out of doors before dawn. But this was a lark that never sang. End of Book 4. Book 5. Degradation. Chapter 1. A Tale of Progress in the Making of Beads. Meanwhile, what of the mother who, as the people of Montfermeil supposed, had abandoned her child? After leaving Cosette with the Thénardiers, Fantine had journeyed on to Montreuil-sur-Mer. This, we may recall, was in the year 1818. It was 10 years since she had left the district, and in that time things had greatly changed. While she had been sinking into the depths of poverty, her native town had grown prosperous. During the past 2 years, there had occurred one of those industrial developments which are major events in the life of a small community. We must give some account of this matter, and indeed dwell upon it, since it is of some importance. The traditional local industry of Montreuil-sur-Mer was the manufacture of imitation English jet beads and the black glass of Germany. Because of the cost of raw materials, the industry had never been prosperous, and its workers had been underpaid, but this situation had recently been transformed. Towards the end of 1815, a newcomer to the town had had the idea of substituting shellac for resin, and had also devised a simpler and less expensive form of clasp for such things as bracelets. These trifling changes amounted to a revolution. They greatly reduced costs, which in the first place enabled the trade to pay higher wages, and thus benefited the district. And they made it possible to reduce prices while increasing the manufacturer's profit. 3 beneficial results, and in less than 3 years the innovator had grown rich, which is good, and had spread prosperity around him, which is better. He was a stranger to the district. Nothing was known of his origins, and little about how he started in life. He was said to have arrived in the town with very little money, a few hundred francs, and with this scanty capital, applied to the service of an ingenious idea, and fostered with order and shrewdness, he had made a fortune for himself and for the community. His clothes, his general appearance, and his speech, when he came to Montreuil-sur-Mer, had been those of a laborer. But it seems that on the December evening when he unobtrusively entered the town, with a pack on his back and a thorn stick in his hand, a serious fire had broken out in the town hall. Plunging into the flames, he had, at the risk of his life, rescued 2 children whose father, as it turned out, was the captain of the gendarmerie. So no one had asked to see his identity papers. He went by the name of Père Madeleine. Chapter 2. Madeleine. He was a man of about 50, reserved in manner but good-hearted, and this was all that could be said about him. Thanks to the rapid growth of the industry which he so admirably reorganized, Montreuil-sur-Mer became a place of some consequence. Large orders came from Spain, which absorbs a great quantity of jet. Sales reached a scale almost rivaling those of London and Berlin, and Père Madeleine's profits were so great that in the second year he was able to build a new factory consisting of 2 large workshops, one for men and the other for women. The needy had only to apply, and they could be sure of finding employment and a living wage. Père Madeleine demanded good will from the men, pure morals from the women, and honesty from all. He separated the sexes so that the women could remain virtuous. In this he was inflexible, but it was the only matter in which he could be said to be intolerant, and since Montreuil-sur-Mer was a garrison town with ample opportunities for backsliding, his severity was the more justified. In general, his coming had been providential for the whole region, once so stagnant, which now pulsed with the vigor of healthy industry. Unemployment and extreme poverty were forgotten. No pocket was so humble that it did not contain a little money, no dwelling so obscure that it did not shelter a little happiness. Through the stir of activity of which he was the cause and center, Père Madeleine, as we have said, had made a fortune for himself. But, strangely, in a man of business, this did not seem to be his principal concern. He seemed to give far more thought to others than to himself. In 1820, he was known to have a credit of 635,000 francs at the banking house of Lafitte, but in addition to setting aside this sum, he had spent more than 1 million on the town and the poor. The hospital was underfinanced. He had endowed 10 more beds. Montreuil was divided into an upper and a lower town. The lower town, where he lived, had only 1 school, of which the ancient building was crumbling in ruins. He built 2 new schools, one for girls and the other for boys, and out of his own income doubled the meager official salaries of the schoolmaster and mistress. To someone who expressed surprise at this, he said, "The first 2 servants of the state are the nurse and the teacher." He established an old people's home, a thing then almost unknown in France, and a fund for the assistance of old and infirm workpeople. With the building of the new factory, a new residential area had sprung up around it, in which there were a good many poor families, so he installed a free apothecary's shop. At first, the town gossip said of him, "He's simply out to make money." When it was found that he enriched the community before enriching himself, they said, "He has political ambitions." This seemed the more likely since he was religious and attended church service, which was considered highly commendable at that time. He went to early Mass every Sunday. The local deputy, always on his guard against competition, viewed this religious tendency with some apprehension. He had himself been a member of the Corps Legislatif under the Empire, and he shared the religious views of an ex-Jesuit named Fauch, the Duke of Otranto, whose creature and friend he had been. In private, he was amiably derisive of God. But when he learned that Madeleine, the wealthy manufacturer, went to 7 o'clock Mass, he scented a possible rival and resolved to outdo him. He engaged a Jesuit confessor and went to High Mass and Vespers. Political rivalry in those days was, almost literally, a race to the altar steps. The poor, as well as God, benefited by the deputy's misgivings, for he also endowed 2 hospital beds, making 12 in all. In 1819, it was rumored in the town that on the recommendation of the prefect and in consideration of his public services, the king was to nominate Monsieur Madeleine mayor of Montreuil-sur-Mer. Those who had declared him to be a political careerist seized upon this with the delight men always feel in exclaiming, "I told you so!" The town was in a state of high excitement, and the rumor turned out to be correct. A few days later, the nomination appeared in La Moniteur. The next day, Monsieur Madeleine refused it. During that same year, 1819, the products of Madeleine's new manufacturing process were displayed at the Industrial Exhibition, and acting on the jury's report, the king appointed the inventor to be a Chevalier of the Légion d'Honneur. This led to a new theory in the town. So that's what he was really after. But Monsieur Madeleine refused to accept the Grand Cross. Decidedly, the man was an enigma. The know-it-alls saved their faces by saying, "Well, anyways, he's up to something." The district owed him a great deal, and the poor owed him everything. He was so invaluable that he had to be honored, and so kindly that he had to be loved. His work-people, in particular, adored him, and he accepted their adoration with a kind of grave melancholy. When it became known that he was extremely rich, the society of the town took notice of him, addressing him as Monsieur Madeleine. But his work-people and the children still called him Père Madeleine, and it was this that drew from him his warmest smile. As he rose in the world, invitations were showered on him. Society sought him out. The doors of Montreuil's most select drawing rooms, which had of course been closed to the tradesmen, were flung wide to welcome the millionaire. Frequent approaches were made to him, but he rejected them all. And here the gossips were on firmer ground. He was, they said, an ignorant and uneducated man. No one knew where he came from. He would not know how to behave in polite society. It was not even certain that he could read. When he was seen to be making money, they had said, "He's a businessman." When he scattered his money in charity, they said, "He's a careerist." When he refused to accept honors, they said, "He's an adventurer." When he rejected polite society, they said, "He's a peasant." By 1820, 5 years after his arrival in Montreuil-sur-Mer, the services he had rendered were so outstanding, and public opinion was so unanimous, that the king again appointed him mayor of the town. Again he refused, but this time, faced by the prefect's rejection of his refusal, the insistence of the local dignitaries, and the supplications of the people in the streets, he finally gave way. It was said that what had induced him to change his mind were the words shouted at him, almost angrily, by an old woman standing in her doorway. "A good mayor is a useful person. How can you hold back when you have the chance to do good?" This was the third stage of his rise in the world. Le Père Madeleine had become Monsieur Madeleine, and Monsieur Madeleine had become Monsieur le Maire. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Sums deposited with Lafitte. In other respects, he remained as simple as on the day of his arrival. He was gray-haired and grave-eyed, with the tanned complexion of a working man and the thoughtful countenance of a philosopher. He ordinarily wore a broad-brimmed hat and a long tailcoat of broadcloth buttoned to the chin. He performed his official duties as mayor, but otherwise kept himself to himself, speaking to few people, evading courtesies, exchanging brief greetings and hastily passing on, smiling to avoid the need for speech, and giving alms to avoid the need for smiling. The women called him a kind old bear. His greatest pleasure was to go for walks through the countryside. He always took his meals alone, with a book at his elbow. He had a small but well-selected library. He loved books, those undemanding but faithful friends. It seemed that his leisure increased with his growing fortune. He made use of it to improve himself. His use of language became more refined, less uncouth, and more discriminating. He often carried a shotgun on his walks, but seldom used it. When he did so, however, he was a terrifyingly good marksman. He never killed a harmless animal or shot at a small bird. Although he was no longer young, it was said of him that he was immensely strong. He had a helping hand for whoever needed it, would hoist a fallen horse to its feet, put a shoulder to a bogged-down wheel, grasp the horns of an escaped bull. He always left home with a pocketful of small change and came back with it empty. When he walked through a village, the ragged children ran after him in delight, swarming round him like flies. He must at some time have lived in the country, for he possessed much recondite knowledge which he passed on to the peasants. He taught them how to destroy corn moth by spraying the barn and soaking the cracks in the floor with a solution of common salt, and how to get rid of boll weevil by hanging branches of orviot in blossom on the walls and in the roofs of storerooms and cottages. He had recipes against vetch and ground ivy and other parasitic weeds that invade a cornfield. He protected a rabbit enclosure against rats simply with the scent of a small Barbary pig which he installed in it. On one occasion, he watched a party of country folk busily engaging in pulling up nettles. Contemplating the uprooted and withering plants, he said, "They're dead, but it would be a good thing if use were made of them. The young nettle is an excellent vegetable, and as it ages, it develops fibers like those of hemp or flax. Nettle cloth is as good as hemp cloth. Chopped nettles can be fed to poultry, and mashed nettles are good for cattle. Nettle seed mixed with their fodder gives the animals a glossy skin. The roots mixed with salt produce an admirably yellow dye. Moreover, nettles are a crop that can be harvested twice a year, and they need almost nothing, very little space, no husbanding, no cultivation. Their only drawback is that the seed falls as it ripens and is difficult to harvest. With very little trouble, nettles can be put to use. Being neglected, they become obnoxious and are therefore destroyed. How many men share the fate of the nettle?" After a moment of silence, he added, "My friends, remember this. There are no bad plants or bad men. There is only bad husbandry." The children loved him especially because he knew how to make fascinating toys out of straw and coconuts. When he saw a church door draped in black, he entered, seeking out funerals as other men seek out christenings. Widowhood and the afflictions of others appealed to his strongly compassionate nature. He mingled with the mourners and the priests chanting round a coffin. It seemed that the words of the funeral psalms, with their vision of another world, were especially attuned to his thoughts. He listened with eyes uplifted, as though straining towards the mysteries of the infinite, to the sad voices singing on the threshold of the abyss of death. He performed countless acts of kindness with as much precaution as though they were misdeeds. He would secretly enter a house after dark and go furtively up the stairs, and some poor devil, returning to his attic, would find that his door had been opened, and even forced in his absence. His instant thought would be that he had been robbed, but then he would find nothing gone and a gold piece lying on the table. The miscreant was Père Madeleine. He was a friendly but sad figure. People said of him, "A rich man who is not proud, a fortunate man who does not look happy." He was a man of mystery. It was said of him that he allowed no one to enter his bedroom, a real anchorite cell furnished with winged hourglasses and decorated with skulls and crossbones. This tale was repeated so often that certain elegant and audacious young ladies called upon him and asked, "Monsieur le Maire, may we be allowed to see your bedroom? It is said to be like a cave." He smiled and at once showed them in, putting them greatly out of countenance. It was a room with commonplace mahogany furniture, as ugly as furniture generally is, and with cheap paper on the walls. They found nothing remarkable in it except 2 candlesticks of an antiquated design on the mantelpiece, which were presumably silver because they were stamped, an observation very typical of the small-town mind. But despite this, people went on saying that no one ever entered that room, and that it was like a tomb or a hermit's cave. It was also rumored that he had immense sums on deposit with Lafitte, and that by a special arrangement, these were held at his immediate disposal, so that he could walk into the bank whenever he chose, and after signing a receipt, walk out with 2 or 3 millions in his pocket. The reality of those 2 or 3 millions was, as we have said, a sum of 630 or 40,000 francs. End of chapter 3.
And cut. That's a wrap, folks. Thanks for listening to today's episode of I've Been Meaning to Read That, with me, your host, Dan. If you want to learn more about the show, you can follow us on Instagram at Meaning to Read and TikTok at I've Been Meaning. If you want to support the show to help keep it going, you can find me on Venmo at Dingus Donut, DINGUSDONUT. Supporters get a shout-out on the show, and even more important, get to vote on the next book that we read. No matter what, I'll see you for our next episode. Until then, read those books you've been meaning to read, and have a lovely, lovely day.